They say animals sense what humans cannot. But what happens when a silent warning from your horse unearths the darkest secret your land has ever known? Caleb Thorne had lived in solitude for 15 quiet years, tending his ranch with weathered hands and a quiet heart. His only companion was Thunder, a majestic black gelding with eyes that had seen storms, dust, and war for 8 years straight. Thunder walked into that stable every single night until one morning he refused. Not just hesitated, refused, eyes wide, hooves locked, snorting like the stable itself held death. That moment marked the unraveling of everything Caleb thought he knew. Because what began as a strange animal reaction would soon lead to a hidden wall, a sealed stone chamber, and the remains of a woman who vanished without a trace 2 decades ago. This isn't just a Western story. It's a haunting true mystery of intuition, justice, buried secrets, and redemption. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will give you chills, and by the end you'll never look at a quiet stable the same way again. If you care about justice, if you believe in the power of animal instincts, you need to hear this story. 15 winters had come and gone since Caleb Thorne first set foot on that stretch of high prairie. Land so still, so wind-worn, it felt like God had forgotten to finish it. There were no neighbors close enough to wave to, no family sending letters. Just the sound of grass bending in the wind, the occasional whinny of his horse, and the steady ache of old injuries earned working the soil. Caleb was a builder by trade, a rancher by necessity, and a man of few illusions. What he couldn't fix with his hands, he didn't put much stock in. The barn, the fencing, the house, he built it all himself, plank by plank, nail by nail, as if carving his own sanctuary out of the stubborn earth. And in all those years and through drought and storm and the slow disintegration of his youth, there was one constant: Thunder, a coal-black gelding with a white blaze down his nose and the kind of eyes that seemed to carry the memory of things long buried. Thunder was more than livestock. He was Caleb's partner, his shadow, and on lonely nights beneath the stars, his only witness. For 8 years, without fail, Thunder walked into the stable at night like a soldier reporting for duty. No fuss, no hesitation. The stable had been his shelter through howling wind and high desert frost. He knew every board, every grain of wood beneath his hooves. But that morning, bright and bone-dry like any other, Caleb led Thunder across the pasture and watched, confused, as the horse came to a dead stop 20 feet from the stable door. At first, Caleb thought maybe a coyote had passed through or a snake had curled up somewhere in the hay. But Thunder didn't just stop. He locked up, dug his hooves into the dirt like anchors, his whole body trembling as if the air ahead of him was made of fire. His head jerked back violently, chains rattling like distant thunder, and a wild, ancient fear ignited in his eyes. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, reaching for the lead rope. But Thunder jerked it from his hand with a force that tore skin from palm. The horse spun in a half-circle, nostrils flared, eyes fixed on the stable like it was alive and watching him back. Caleb had seen animals spooked before, horses startled by a rattler, dogs howling at distant thunderheads. But this wasn't fear of something momentary. This was terror, deep and primal, the kind of fear bred in the marrow, handed down through bloodlines. Thunder didn't look at any one part of the stable. His eyes took in the whole thing as if the entire structure had become hostile, poisoned by something no man could see. Caleb walked the perimeter, inspecting every wall and corner like a man hunting ghosts. The hay was fresh, the water trough clean. There were no loose beams, no signs of rot or mold, no scent of predator. It looked exactly the same as it had the night before. But Thunder refused, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt something stir in his own chest, something cold and crawling. He circled back to the horse, who was now pacing, ears pinned flat, breath coming in short bursts like a creature trying to outrun its own heartbeat. Caleb touched his muzzle gently. "You've walked into that stall 1,000 times," he said softly. "What changed, boy?" For the next 3 hours, Caleb tried everything. He brought out oats, led Thunder toward the back entrance, even walked into the stable himself with calm, deliberate steps, speaking in a low voice meant to reassure. But no amount of coaxing mattered. Thunder wouldn't go near the place. Every time Caleb pulled gently on the rope, the horse backed away harder, hooves dragging deep furrows into the soil. It was more than stubbornness. It was desperation. And the look in his eyes wasn't confusion or hesitation. It was certainty. Caleb finally let the rope drop. He stood alone in front of the stable door, the morning sun climbing higher behind him, casting long shadows across the pasture. And though he was a man who believed in logic, in nails and hammers and measurable problems, he found himself whispering under his breath, "What the hell are you trying to tell me?" Thunder didn't answer, of course, but his silence said everything. By noon, the sun sat high and still, baking the valley into silence. But the quiet wasn't peace, it was pressure. Caleb tied Thunder beneath the cottonwood near the house, shaded and far from the stable, yet the horse continued to pace, eyes never leaving the structure that had become a stranger. It was then that Caleb noticed something else, something that twisted his gut further than he liked to admit. The chickens, usually bold and nosy, refused to come within 30 yards of the barn. The barn cats, typically impossible to contain, huddled beneath the porch, eyes wide, tails twitching. Even the dog, a half-blind shepherd named Barlow, who'd once lunged at a bear, whined and slinked away when Caleb tried to bring him close to the stable's shadow. The ranch itself had gone quiet, as if the very land was holding its breath. No bird song, no wind through the high grass. Just the steady creak of sun-baked timber, and a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt crowded, full of something unnamed. Animals know things, Caleb remembered his father saying once. They remember places the way men forget. The sound of boots crunching gravel broke the silence near dusk. Henrik Jensen, Caleb's nearest neighbor and as weathered as the fence posts he hammered, came trudging up the hill, leaning on a cane more for habit than need. Not far behind him was Marcus Estrada, younger, quieter, the kind of man who listened before he spoke, and when he did speak, it mattered. "Heard your horse was kicking up a storm," Henrik said, his brow creased beneath a sweat-stained hat. Caleb gave a slow nod. "He won't go in, not even close." Marcus eyed Thunder from a distance, noting the way the horse's muscles trembled beneath his glossy hide. "That ain't just spooked," Marcus said quietly. "That's fear, deep kind." Henrik stroked his beard. "That animal's been steady as a compass since the day you got him. If he's acting like this, something's wrong, whether we can see it or not." They walked with Caleb toward the stable. Thunder watched but didn't follow. He stood rigid, breathing hard, muscles twitching. When Marcus approached the doorway, even his own voice lowered to a near whisper. "You ever hear about animals refusing to cross graves?" Caleb didn't put much faith in folklore, but he trusted Marcus's instincts more than most men's facts. Together, they began to examine the stable with a carpenter's eye. Caleb ran his palm along the boards. Everything looked right, no rot, No collapse, no snake's nests. But as he moved deeper inside, something kept tugging at his sense of proportion. "The back wall," he muttered. "It feels closer than it should be." Marcus tilted his head. "You built this yourself?" 15 years ago. Measured it to the inch." Caleb paced the length, stopped, turned, counted again. "It's off," he said, tapping the heel of his boot on the floor. "By maybe 2 feet. There's space here that shouldn't exist." Marcus pulled a small lantern from his saddlebag and struck a match. The soft orange light pushed back the gloom, flickering across timbers. They moved toward the rear wall. Caleb knocked softly. Most of it gave the expected solid thud of wood braced against packed earth. But one section, maybe 4 feet wide, rang hollow. They exchanged a glance. "You hear that?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Caleb said, "and it shouldn't be there." Outside, thunder let out a sharp, piercing whinny, high and wild like a siren in a dream. It wasn't just distress anymore. It was warning. The sky had begun to fade into rust-red dusk, and with it came a strange, creeping pressure, like something old and heavy was waking beneath the soil. Thunder's panic intensified. He reared against the tether, hooves scraping the ground, the whites of his eyes visible even in the fading light. The air around the barn felt wrong, not cold, but empty, like the warmth had been sucked from it. Caleb stepped out of the stable and looked toward his horse. Thunder was soaked in sweat, snorting, breath fogging in the cool air, and still staring at the wall. "Whatever's behind there," Marcus said. "It's not nothing," Henrik nodded grimly. "And if the animals are this rattled, maybe we ought to listen before it's too late." Caleb looked back at the stable, at the structure he had built with care, pride, and certainty. Now, for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure what it was hiding. At dawn, Caleb stood alone before the stable wall with a crowbar in one hand and dread heavy on his shoulders. Thunder had not slept. All night he had paced his makeshift enclosure, eyes fixed on the barn as if expecting something to crawl from its shadow. Now he stood still, frozen, muscles tight like coiled wire, trembling with knowledge no man could translate. Caleb approached the rear wall slowly. The hollow echo still rang in his ears. He pressed his palm to the boards and felt, not resistance, but breathless space. Marcus arrived just as Caleb crouched low to inspect the seam between boards. "You ready?" he asked. "No," Caleb said, "but I'm doing it anyway." With a grunt and a twist, Caleb drove the crowbar under the first board. The nails gave with a groan, wood splitting like dry bone. A gust of cold, musty air whispered out from the gap. They froze. Not the scent of damp earth. Something worse. Older, decay and iron. Marcus lit the lantern and handed it over, his face pale in the morning haze. Caleb peeled back the second board, then the third, and the darkness inside looked back. The lantern's glow spilled into a narrow, hand-hewn tunnel lined with jagged stones. Rough work, done in haste, not care. The space stretched roughly 6 feet back, then opened into a small chamber just tall enough for a person to stand. The air inside was still, too still, like it hadn't been stirred in years. Marcus stepped closer, then immediately recoiled. "That smell! God!" Caleb didn't answer. He pushed the lantern further in, revealing walls covered in long, desperate scratches. Not random marks, carvings. Words scrawled in jagged lines, some barely legible. One stood out like a scream. "Help." Below it, more letters. A name, uneven but unmistakable. Sarah Collins. And beneath that, Tell my family. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. The name meant nothing to him, but it meant everything to Elena, who had just arrived. Eyes wide and fists clenched at her sides. She was a school teacher, Elena whispered. She disappeared 22 years ago. Folks thought she ran off, but her mama never believed it. Marcus looked around slowly, voice hollow. She didn't run. She was buried alive, behind your wall. In the corner of the chamber, where the stones met dirt, lay a bundle of faded cloth, damp with age and half covered in dust and hay fragments. Caleb moved toward it slowly, the lantern trembling in his grip. When the light hit it just right, the shape became clear. A human skeleton, curled as if in sleep, one bony hand still clutched around something glinting dully in the lantern light. Caleb crouched, with the gentlest touch. He brushed away the grime and found a small locket, tarnished silver, its chain long broken. Inside, a faded photograph of a young woman with soft eyes and a kind smile. On the back, worn but still readable, to Sarah, with love. Mother. Caleb's throat closed. The earth had kept her secret, but thunder had not. Caleb staggered back from the chamber, light dancing wildly across the stone. Memories he didn't know he had rushed forward, of building this wall, alone, exhausted, 15 years ago. He had packed earth tight against the back. There had been no cavity, no space, no reason for this room to exist. Someone had added it afterward, or worse, before. Marcus examined the wall more closely. The boards that had concealed the chamber were not original. The wood was lighter, the nails newer, the craftsmanship rushed. This wasn't here when you built the stable, Marcus said. Caleb's voice was gravel. No, it wasn't. The only one who could have done it was Jeremiah Slate, the land's previous owner, a reclusive man who vanished after selling the ranch cheap, cash in hand, no questions asked. Now, the questions were clawing their way out of the stone. Thunder's scream shattered the stillness, high, ragged, primal. Not a whinny, a cry, the cry of something ancient and knowing, the kind of sound a horse makes only when it's seen too much. Elena backed away from the entrance, eyes wide with horror. We need to call the sheriff, she said, voice shaking. Caleb looked down at the message on the wall, at the bones of a woman who had died trying to reach the outside world with her fingernails, at the locket in her hand, still warm from the lantern's glow. He nodded, but his legs wouldn't move, because the silence inside that chamber was still speaking to him, and it was saying something no man ever wants to hear. You walked past this wall for 15 years, and you never knew she was there. By mid-afternoon, the sheriff arrived. Clayton Morse stepped out of his dusty patrol truck with the weary stride of a man who'd seen too much and still wasn't ready for this. Behind him came Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the county coroner, and Deputy Williams with camera gear slung over one shoulder. Caleb stood silent as he led them to the chamber, Thunder pacing nervously in the distance, unable to relax even with the stable torn open. Inside, flashbulbs lit up the hollow tomb, each burst capturing the silent agony etched in stone. Dr. Hayes crouched beside the remains, murmuring notes, her gloved hands tender despite years in the field. This chamber wasn't accidental, she said, examining the crude stonework. It was built to imprison. The air holes in the back are too small for escape, but just enough to keep someone breathing. Sheriff Morse ran a hand along his jaw, eyes locked on the name scrawled into the wall. Sarah Collins. She disappeared 22 years ago, he said. We interviewed Slate back then, said he'd seen her walking near the ridge that evening, claimed he went into town. His alibi held. But no one searched the land? Caleb asked. The sheriff's voice dropped. We never thought to. Not this deep, not with the stable built over it. But now they knew. And Jeremiah Slate, who had vanished after selling Caleb the land, had a sin clawing its way back to the surface. It didn't take long to find him. Slate had been living under a false name in Colorado, a quiet old man in a rented trailer with yellowed curtains and a loaded pistol in the drawer beside his bed. But when the news reached him that they'd found Sarah, he broke. In the end, he confessed, he'd watched her walk home from school every Friday. She took the same shortcut through his property. She was young, bright, always smiling when she waved to him. One day, she didn't wave, and that, he claimed, broke something inside him. He built the chamber in secret, took her one night and locked her away, convinced she'd come around, but Sarah never did. She fought, scratched, screamed, died carving her name into stone. He'd sealed the wall, sold the land, and vanished into anonymity. Until thunder brought her back. Sarah Collins was finally laid to rest on a warm afternoon that felt oddly quiet. The whole town came, ranchers, teachers, children who'd once sat in her classroom. Caleb and Thunder stood side by side behind her mother, a fragile woman in her 80s who held the tarnished locket with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered to Thunder as he gently bowed his head. "You brought her home." The old stable came down plank by plank, each board stacked carefully like bones being buried. Caleb didn't reuse the wood. He burned it all, not out of anger, but reverence. Some structures weren't meant to stand once the truth was out. He built the new stable near the stream, far from the chamber. Thunder entered it willingly, calmly, as if he understood that the land had been made right again. And where the chamber once stood, Caleb and Elena planted wildflowers. Mrs. Collins came every week to tend them, her frail hands brushing over the soil where her daughter had once pleaded for rescue. A plaque was set in stone. "In memory of Sarah Collins, you were not forgotten." The wind passed gently through the grass there, no longer still, no longer holding its breath. For a while, Caleb couldn't sleep, not from guilt, but from the weight of what he'd missed for 15 years. He had walked past that wall, fed animals near it, leaned tools against it, and Sarah had been behind it all along. He started watching Thunder more closely, not just as a companion, but as a guide. Thunder had felt what no man could. He had spoken with his silence, with his refusal. He had told the truth with every trembling step backward. People in the valley began telling their own stories of animals refusing barns, dogs refusing to cross certain thresholds, of instincts ignored, of signs passed over. Some even reopened cold cases, searching where their animals had once frozen in place. "Animals know things we've forgotten," Mrs. Collins had said, and Caleb believed her now, completely. Jeremiah Slate died in prison 2 years later. No visitors, no letters. His last words were never recorded. Mrs. Collins passed not long after. She was buried beside her daughter, beneath a pair of headstones that bore more truth than 1,000 sermons. Thunder lived for 10 more years. He never again showed fear near any structure, never reared, never trembled. It was as if, in exposing the truth, his burden had been lifted. And Caleb? He worked the land quietly, same as always. But now, he listened, closely. To the animals, to the wind, to the stillness. Because he had learned a lesson written in stone and silence, some secrets refuse to stay buried. And when the creatures of the earth speak, wise men learn to listen. Sometimes, the loudest screams are the ones we never hear. Sarah Collins didn't die in a storm or on the run. She died right there, behind a wall walked past by dozens of men, and yet only one being heard her, a horse who refused to forget. It begs the question, what truths are we walking past in our own lives? What silences are we ignoring because they're too quiet, too strange, too inconvenient? Thunder didn't speak with words, but his defiance shattered 22 years of lies. And Caleb's journey reminds us, when something doesn't feel right, pause, look closer, listen. The world still whispers, sometimes. Justice comes not with a gunshot, but a hoofbeat. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts below. We read every comment. Your voice might be the spark for someone else's reckoning. Drop a comment. Tell us, what part hit you the hardest? Save this video. You might need it again, when silence speaks in your own life. And if you believe in stories that matter, stories that echo, subscribe now. We're just getting started. Because some stories aren't just told, they're unearthed. And you were meant to hear this one.